Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Guns and Mental Health, the counseling edition. We have two editions now. Sometimes we'll have guests on. It'll just be me and Mike interviewing somebody, and this one is our counseling version with the counselors. DB Palmer is on assignment. That means that he is out doing things that are probably more fun than staring at a computer screen. But with us are Brandon and Eddie and the illustrious Michael Sedini.
I
Good
like
morning, gentlemen.
that.
Illustrious does not mean that you're an illustrator or graphic designer. It just means that you're held in high regard.
I thought I was about to start painting photos for you.
You can paint photos. I don't know how you would do that, but you could take photos. Apparently, that's how illustrious you are.
Are you gonna
Yep.
paint us like your French
Illustrious
girls?
Arizona State University. What? What, Eddie?
You gonna paint us like your French girls?
Paint me at Birmingham, perhaps. Although you'd be painting me at Vegas.
And we've already lost half our listeners.
They're citing country songs and making fun of each other. No, we're gonna talk about William Glasser's five basic needs today, and this new format that we're doing that we've kind of fiddled and played with. We're gonna we're gonna do a teaching in the beginning, and if we have a guest, sometimes we'll have a counseling type guest on. We'll interview them, and then we'll spend some time talking about either the teaching or just pinging questions, around asking the guest what's up, and then we'll do a little summary. We'll do some application to how it might apply to people's lives, specifically in the firearms community, and then we'll wrap the cast. So that's going to be the format moving forward, for better or worse, and we'll see how it goes. So today I'm going to take the helm and I'm going to teach on something called choice theory, also known as reality therapy. And it was developed by a guy named William Glasser. He was a psychiatrist and he did a lot of writing. It's very good stuff. He's written several books on a whole bunch of topics, not just in the counseling realm, but some of my favorites are Choice Theory is the title of a book. Reality Therapy is the title of another book. Reality Therapy in Action is yet another one where he takes every individual chapter and turns it into a case presentation. It's a super fun read because you get to see how he applied these tips and techniques and interventions to patients. Another one that he wrote is called Positive Addiction. And that's a really fascinating book because you don't think of addiction as a positive usually. The way that our culture frames addiction is always negative. But Positive Addiction is a great book by Glasser. And then he's also got one called Fibromyalgia, Hope from a Completely Different Perspective, or Hope from a Totally Different Perspective. And the fibromyalgia one is really interesting because he and guys like John Sarno, who is also a medical doctor, they do a mind body connection description of how the mind and the body interact, and how when we get mentally disturbed, mentally ill, psychologically unwell, what we can end up having is physiological reactions to that, meaning our bodies will respond to whatever's going on in the mind. Because what happens with the mind is you can think of things and they can have a neurological effect, and if you don't deal with that well, those neurochemicals will float through your body and not get processed accurately. And they'll end up in things that we often refer to as mystery ailments, where we may have treatment for them. They may have a pill to deal with something like fibromyalgia or migraine headaches or, stomach pain or other joint pains that are just kind of unexplained by physical deformities or injuries. And usually it boils down to somebody's really struggling mentally. And so they end up with these body problems that, go away when the mental illness is treated. So it's really fascinating stuff. William Glasser is one of my favorite people. He died some years ago, probably, I think 2017 or so. But he lived a really long time, did some really groundbreaking work. And the Glasser Institute now is carried on by a team of people. Chief among them is a guy named Robert Wubbelding, which is one of my favorite last names in all the world. And Robert Wubbelding has written several books on this topic as well. So if you're interested in this at the end of it, you can pick up any of those books and review them. We'll put them in the show notes too. But I'm going to start by explaining two concepts that I'll explain three, and I'll go through them as carefully as I can, and hopefully you'll take some stuff away. So I'll tee this up. I'll give the little brief presentation. I don't have a slide deck or anything because I know that most of our people listen through the audio format, which challenges me to do a better job describing it instead of relying on the visuals. So the first thing I want to talk about is Glasser's five basic needs. And I also have a YouTube video on this where I'm in front of a whiteboard describing it. So if you want to spend 15 or 20 minutes watching the YouTube video to get a better understanding, you can get that at the Zephyr Wellness YouTube channel. Just type in Glasser's 5 basic needs. So these 5 basic needs are, as Glasser puts it, they exist solely to justify or explain all human behavior. So anything we do, from thinking to fidgeting to hobbies and activities, anything we do, any behavior is done to meet one or more of these 5 basic needs. And I'll list them off very quickly and I'll explain them again. So the 5 basic needs are survival, which is just the basic need to stay alive. Then you have freedom, fun, and then love and belonging, and then power and control. So if we break these out, I mentioned that survival is anything you do to just stay alive. So that would be eating, breathing, etc. Um, Freedom is pretty self-explanatory. All humans have the basic need to be free, to be autonomous, to have liberty, and to choose for themselves what they want. And that's the root of choice theory. Choice theory says that you're going to choose what's best for you and in your own best interests. Some of those interests obviously can impact others. If I choose to be philanthropic, then it makes me feel good, of course. But I also am connected to a community that I benefit from if everybody's healthier, then my philanthropy ultimately ends up helping me. But along the way, I'm helping others. So um, the power of choice is very important. And if we take that choice away, we are impinging on freedom. So there's a psychological basic need to have freedom. And a big thing in the firearms community is freedom, right? Liberty. We want to be able to be free to choose how we defend ourselves and go about our business. So freedom is one of our 5 basic needs. Fun is another basic need that we do activities to provide enjoyment in our lives. And the idea is that if we can do things that are enjoyable, we're going to end up experiencing a much more full and robust and appreciative and grateful life. Love and belonging is another basic need. And love and belonging means that we have to connect with people. We need to, don't think of this, I would encourage you not to think of this solely in the form of romantic love. And we all know that, Greeks had multiple words for love. There's agape love, which is godly love. There's philios, which is brotherly love. There's eros, which is erotic or romantic love. But the point is, love and belonging, connection to other human beings, is one of our 5 basic needs. And if we don't get that need met, we get unhealthy. And then finally, power and control. We want to be in control of stuff. We want to be in control of our environments. We want to be in control of our decision making. So, of those 5 basic needs, when we start to apply that lens or that filter to examining why people do what they do, it makes it really obvious to explain why they do what they do. So, if I, say we have a teenager who's refusing to do his homework, and I apply the 5 basic needs lens to figure out what the purpose of this behavior is, we can figure out what he's doing to meet these needs. So maybe he's gaining power and control by refusing to do his homework because ultimately nobody can make him do his homework. And in a weird, twisted way, that may actually meet his love and belonging need too, because if he gets attention from his parents or his teachers by yelling at him and threatening him, saying, "You're going to fail if you don't do your homework," that is a form of love and belonging. It is a form of human connection. Now, unfortunately, it's an unhealthy form of human connection. So, something that I did to help explain this a little bit better, and this is not necessarily a Glasser thing; it's a Jake thing. Is I scale it. So imagine in your mind a scale going from 0 to 100, and 0 is really really unhealthy, and 100 would be the most healthy you could have. For example, let's take another basic need and survival. So we go, well, why does the homeless guy down the road dig through trash to find food that I throw away? Well, he's meeting his basic need for survival. He has to eat, but that's on the low end of the healthy scale, somewhere in the 1 to 10 range, perhaps, if he's eating a hamburger that somebody discarded. Now, what would be a healthier way to get that need met would be on the higher end, and that would be like a steak dinner. That's somewhere in the 80s or 90s, I would suspect. So, what we want to do in counseling is, if we're finding, if we're using these 5 basic needs to analyze human behavior, we want to move people from the unhealthy to the healthy by offering different options, choices, in other words. And what's cool about the choice angle is if we present things as decisions, somebody's got the power and control, the freedom, in other words, to choose, then likely they will choose things that will benefit them in a more positive, productive, healthy way. And what's interesting is a lot of times people who are suffering psychologically, don't believe, or at least they don't see, that they have many other choices. They get stuck in maybe a rigid pattern, and we might call this binary, either or, where they only see two choices. And that can drive a lot of anxiety if you don't see a bunch of choices. So our jobs as counselors is to help offer more choices. We'll say, well, have you considered this? Have you considered this? And all of a sudden, when you get more choices, the options open up. And with more options, you're likely to choose something that's going to get you closer to being healthy. So we want to invite choice. Now, along the way, there's another model that Glasser offers to describe these five basic needs. And I really like this model. He calls it the total behavior car. This is where it's fun to have a slide deck, but I don't have a slide deck, so I'm just going to describe it. So think about a car, and you're looking at it maybe from the top. It's an aerial view of a car, and you can see the wheels, and you can see the hood, and maybe the steering wheel through the windshield. And what this car would be described as is having some component parts that are useful for helping the person do their behaviors. So bear with me here as I describe this. So picture your car, right? Now, we have the needs, the five basic needs, and those would be the engine under the hood. Your five basic needs of survival, freedom, fun, power and control, love and belonging. Those are the engine that drive the car. Now, the steering wheel is your wants. What do you want? And then you'll steer to wherever you want. The rear tires, one would be feeling and the other would be physiology. So feelings we don't have much control over, and that's one of Glasser's statements is in life we have control over almost everything except feeling and physiology. For example, you don't really have a lot of control over whether or not you sweat when the temperature rises. That would be physiology. That would be your body's response to the environment. We also don't have much control over feelings. If you want more information about this, you can watch my emotional functioning videos on the Zephyr Wellness website. There's a whole series of our 10 core emotions, and I won't get into that here. Um, but the idea is that when the environment stimulates something in your brain that causes a feeling, whether it be a physical feeling like hot or cold or fatigue or hunger, or it's an emotional feeling like one of our 10 core emotions, sadness, guilt, shame, anger, disgust, so forth, you don't necessarily have control over it. What you do have control over is how much and how long you feel it. So that would be like the brakes of the car. You could pump the brakes sometimes on your physiology by slowing your heart rate down. If you're getting excited, you can acknowledge your emotions and self-validate to push through the emotional wave. And you can slow those down or accelerate them. I can, for example, direct my thoughts towards something pleasurable and have happy chemicals flowing through my brain. I can be joyous simply by thinking about something that's enjoyable. But those are the rear tires. The front wheels then would be thinking and doing things that you do have control over. I have control over my thoughts that would then influence my feelings. I have control over my actions or my choices, my doing, in other words. So whatever I do is the front tires. Remember, so your wants are steering your thinking, you're doing with the wheel, right? Your wants at the steering wheel, it's steering your thinking and doing. The rear tires that you don't have too much control over, they propel the car. The engine is your basic needs. So put this all together, and now we can get a little bit better picture on how to help somebody who's really struggling by saying, well, let's look at this. So Glasser offers us another lens through which we can see this, and the acronym is WDEP. The first thing we would ask is the W, want. What do you want? And that's how we open most of our sessions, and at least our intakes. Is somebody comes into the office and you go, "Hey, I'm Jake. Hi, I'm Eddie. What brings you in today?" And then Eddie says something and that becomes a problem, right? This is problem area. And maybe there's a diagnosis that goes along with that. And at the end, I go, well, what do you want? What do you want to do about that? And then Eddie says what he wants to do about it. And then the D is what are you doing to get what you want? So I'm talking about wants, W, D, doing. What are you doing? So we're asking, what are you doing to get there? And then he'll say, well, I want a cheeseburger. We'll keep it simple. I want a cheeseburger. Well, what are you doing to get the cheeseburger? He'll say, well, I went to this taco stand down the road to get a cheeseburger. And I go, and then the E would come in, that's evaluate. And I'd ask, is that working? Is that working for you to get your cheeseburger at a taco joint? And then he'd probably say something like, well, no, it's not. And then P is the plan. What do you want to change? How do you plan to get there to get what you want? You say, well, probably not go to a taco joint. I probably got to go to a burger joint. So what wants W? What are you doing? D, evaluate. How's that working for you? And then plan. What do you plan to do to get what you want? And if we look at the lens of the total behavior card, the 5 basic needs, and overlay them all, we get a pretty good idea that Eddie's in charge of his decision making as long as he can be aware of what's propelling it. Is emotion propelling it? Is he physiologically hungry? That's why he wants a cheeseburger. So he's meeting his survival need. Um, is it something more? He wants a cheeseburger with friends, and that would be meeting the love and belonging need too. The power and control comes in the form of what toppings do you want on the cheeseburger? Is it just a cheeseburger, or do you have pickles and onions and lettuce and tomato on it? And then ultimately, we might even say, all right, what else is this meeting? Is this meeting your freedom need? You got the freedom to choose burger joint or taco joint. Maybe the taco joint sells burgers. Maybe they have birria on them. That would be a birria burger. Um, he's got the freedom. And ultimately, maybe it's fun to eat a cheeseburger too. So we can look through this lens and solve pretty much any problem as long as we're inspiring the confidence of the individual to know that they are ultimately in charge of what they do. So that's the brief, 10-ish minute teaching that I have for this. I'm going to kick it around and see what you guys have as initial thoughts. I know that Brandon's way into Glasser stuff too, so maybe we'll start with Brandon, and I'll shut up and get out of the way.
Definitely. No, I think you nailed everything. Did a really good job explaining everything. So I love the part where you rate on a scale of 0 to 100 how healthy those choices are, because sometimes when you're making a choice, it's not always an easy one. It could be like a double-edged sword, but at the end of the day, you still have a choice. It's just a matter of using that self-reflection to gauge how healthy that choice is. The WDEP process, that's something that's also really near and dear to my heart. I remember learning about that in school when I was in grad school to be a counselor. And I thought it was funny when I was learning about it because, prior to that, I was working a sales job that I really didn't want to do. And I was thinking to myself, okay, what is it that I want right now? What I wanted was to be happy in my career. What I was doing about it was all I was doing was trying to overachieve in my job, trying to make more money and just trying to find happiness in all the wrong places. When I evaluated what is it that I want to do about it, I realized, okay, this is not working for me. So I started to plan, and that plan was to go to school. And then, obviously through that course, there was a lot of evaluation and, tweaks to the plan. But I remember when I learned about this in school, I was thinking, like, I actually did all of this and I had no idea what it was. So I actually had a question for you too. So I'm wondering, kind of with me, I was able to kind of figure that out on my own. But when you're going over this with your clients, is this something that you teach to them, kind of like you just did with us, or is this something that you just kind of keep in the back of your head and kind of guide them along the way?
Great question. It depends. I love teaching. Our realm, we call it psychoeducation because you can't just call it teaching. That's not fancy enough. So we call it psychoeducation. Um, I love teaching because I believe that teaching not only gives people information and knowledge that they can take away, that reduces the dependence on me as the person behind the curtain to pulling levers or whatever, and turns it into less of a parlor trick and more of an applicable, useful skill that they can just continue to use the rest of their lives and never come back to my office. So I love teaching. What else teaching does is it builds rapport. If I can offer something to somebody and they learn from me, they're excited to come back because they know that they're going to get something out of the session, and it empowers them to say, well, if Jake can do this, I could probably do it too. And I've said this a million times, but I believe in the infinite capacity of human beings to achieve anything, great and terrible. But I believe in the infinite capacity. So I'm going to tap into that and say, just because I went to grad school and I have thousands of hours of contact time and experience doesn't mean that you can't also learn this. I think all humans can learn this. So my job is to work myself out of a job. So I will usually default to teaching. I'll go on the whiteboard, I'll explain it, and I'll use their personal stories, their lived experiences, and their very specific examples to drive the point home so that they can digest it appropriately. I won't use something esoteric that doesn't apply. If they're not dealing with cheeseburgers, but they're dealing with divorce, I'm gonna frame it in their world, right? Now, the other side of that is you don't share that and you do a more psychoanalytic Socratic method where you possess the information in your own brain, but you're asking the questions to lead the person to their own conclusions based on the same framework. And you can use words like, I wonder if that's working for you. I'm evaluating there, right? That's the E of the WDEP. I might ask them, what are you doing to get that? And I try to do it in a non-threatening, non-condescending, non-judgmental way. I'm not going to be like, well, what are you doing to fix it? That would be making what Conti would call the error of approach. I'm approaching poorly and I'm shutting them down. I'm triggering their fight or flight and defensiveness, and they're unlikely to respond as well. So I want to watch my voice when I ask those questions. I tend not to do that though, because I prefer to default to the information empowering that I mentioned earlier. So my method is I teach at the outset. And also the third thing that teaching does is it gives me a foundation to which I can refer later when I say, "Hey, remember that thing that we talked about 6 weeks ago with the five basic needs?" And they'll kind of nod blankly because it's been 6 weeks, and I'll say, "Let me review it." I'll go back to the whiteboard. I'll scratch it all out, and they go, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay, okay." So now I'm doing repetition. It's what we do in school with homework. Repetition tends to ingrain things a little bit better so that they remember it down the road. So I love teaching. I will teach at the outset. Sometimes I will do a hybrid of both where I'll walk them down the thing and I'll say, "Hey, you probably don't realize what I just did there with you, but let me put it on the board. That wasn't just me asking questions out of curiosity. I actually had an intentionality to ask those specific questions, and here's where it comes from. And here's this guy who wrote these books. If you want to learn more, go read them." And then that really crystallizes it. So sometimes I'll go back and forth and do both. But what I don't want it to look like is I'm the expert who has all the knowledge and they're the empty waiting vessel into which I dump my knowledge, because that does create a dependence. They're like, "I don't know why counseling helps. I just go back." I don't want that. I want people to know exactly why counseling helps, and then them to take those same knowledge base and skill set and go use it in their own life and solve their own problems.
So, Jake, you keep saying going back to the whiteboard. For you, that's not a metaphor, right? You're actually showing it physically for people to see.
Yeah. I like tangible, useful things. That's why I like metaphors too, because it creates an imagery that drives it home. If it's just textbook knowledge, it's not great. So I like drawing, and I like writing things, and I like giving things to people so they can hold them. Worksheets sometimes, but worksheets just add another layer of effort that they have to carve out time to do. So I'm not a big fan of that. I'd rather have it rolling around in their head.
Yep. What I like about this, because it is you're going over I guess the different categories, and I'm thinking about how much each one of those categories can apply to being part of the 2A community. Like that's exactly the way I was looking at it. You're like sense of belonging, right? Like once you're in the firearms community, you get that. Obviously survival, fun, like all these things are what people get from gun ownership. So that's pretty cool.
So let's talk more about this. The 2A thing. I know that I've got a million examples and ideas and instances, but I want you guys to kick this around because our whole point is to bridge the gap between firearms community and mental health so that they don't seem so opposite, and that's the point of this teaching. So um, I'll step out of the way. People are tired of listening to me. Go ahead, you guys.
So I'll jump in here. I know I shared in the past a long time ago on one of the podcasts that like firearms saved my life, even though they almost took my life. And the reason behind that is I, at one point in my life, I had suicide ideations, and there was a gun to my head and stuff. You can listen to that and hear that in an old episode, one of the Guns and Mental Health episodes. I think it was the one that me and Jake hosted. That story personally came out. The reason I say that though is that with my background as a fire EMS, I struggled with PTSD immensely. And even though I'd always been a competition shooter and always had guns around me and always been a hunter, it was going back and reinvigorating and finding that competition and finding that like community again is what kind of got me out of that funk in a sense. On top of actual counseling and help and stuff, but I met the need for community, I met the need for love, and I met the need for like a sense of belonging because I rediscovered my passion for competing and setting aside time to shoot and setting aside time to go and practice and just ground myself in that self-care.
Yeah, and I think a good example for me is when I had that break-in that I talked about that happened to me several years ago, and before that I was very gun neutral, didn't really have any opinions on guns, and when I got a gun, it fulfilled my survival need because I know that if something like this were to happen again, I know that I would be able to protect myself. It fulfilled that love and belonging because kind of how And he was talking about PTSD. I had a lot of acute stress symptoms from that break in to where, I was worried about something happening to my wife. So, that kind of helped my, love and belonging. And I think power and control, I think this is a really interesting one because a lot of times when you say power and control, that's viewed as a bad thing. But, there's a difference between like a narcissistic power and control and a healthy power and control, right? So, for example, for me, I would like to eventually be a firearms instructor on the side just because, in this community, safety is very, very important. So I want to have the power and control knowing that the people that I would teach with that are going to walk away with the right skills and the right knowledge. So I think, kind of like Jake said, I mean, there's hundreds of reasons we could go over, like, how this correlates.
Yeah,
I
I
want
think
to talk about, sorry, Mike, I was going to say, I want to talk about the power and control at some point down the road too. So I'm going to put a pin in that. If we forget, remind me.
Well, I was going to say something about the power and control. I was going to say that it's not, it definitely, I don't think it is a negative, Brandon. I think like when people come into the 2A community and they have firearms in the house or they conceal carry, I think you're less likely to get in silly fights and things like that. You're more in control because you have a lot to lose. That you have that firearm. So I totally hear what you're saying about that. I don't view it as a negative. It's, you have the power to defend yourself, you have the power to defend others, and you're in control usually. I remember there was a time I was walking around. I think I was in Philadelphia. Was I in I think I was in Philadelphia, or maybe I was in DC for a Mental Health America thing. And it was really funny because a fight broke out in the subway, and the vice president of Mental Health America, her name's Debbie Plotnick, like immediately ran behind me because she's like, I know you have a gun. And what's funny is I didn't. But she perceived that I had the power and control down in that little subway station. Nothing happened. It was two people getting in a fight down in the subway. But there's a perception of control and power when you have a firearm.
You also feel powerless when you don't have those in your situation at times. I have a perfect example. This past year, I was up in Canada for a week to go to a bunch of hockey games with my father-in-law. And going through the subways in Toronto, they have a high a homeless population. Unfortunately, when it comes to homeless, there's a whole host of other issues. Not all of them. Not everyone who's homeless is going to be on drugs. That's just there. There are the outliers though, and unfortunately, one of the gentlemen that was on the subway, he clearly was under some influence of something, and me and my father-in-law were just talking, and this guy gets up, starts screaming at people in their face. This guy gets 2 inches from my face, starts screaming at me, and I don't have a back down bone in my body, unfortunately. So like I'm just staring him right in the eyes, but the entire time I'm sitting there thinking like, what am I going to do if this guy actually swings? Because I really don't feel like getting into a fight in Canada.
The interesting thing about power and control is that if you disconnect from the idea of positive control over something like assertion, grabbing, holding, deciding, the most power I think we have is the power not to act, to the power to let go, the power to acknowledge we don't have control. Nobody gets to choose that except us. And that gets to the concept of choice as well. So when I talk to people who are really struggling with letting go with stuff, it could be abuse or neglect or violence, or it could be crimes that were perpetrated against them, or just a broken heart. Ultimately, you decide where you send your power, who you give it to. And that is the ultimate form of power, to say, you don't have power over me because I have power over myself, and I'm just choosing not to give it to you. So, in a very paradoxical way, choosing to be powerless, choosing to let go, is the most powerful thing we can have. So, when we got power struggles, for example, between parent and child, or two spouses, or whatever it may be, I will often say, why don't you yield? Why don't you let go? And it's like, but I have to win. No, no, you can choose to let go and choose to not make it about your ego, and choose not to make it about the bravado or the stance or the position you take or the victory or whatever story you're going to tell later, and instead choose to de-escalate. And that's where I think we get the be the bigger man phrase comes from, be the bigger woman, let go. you have more power than the other person if you have self-control. And I think that's a really cool paradoxical presentation that most people don't think about. When they think about power and control, it's about winning or controlling others. Eddie.
And the Jake used the example of a parents fighting or a parent fighting with their child. But like, let's use a bigger example here. When someone says the words "they made me mad," no one makes you mad. You choose to get mad. They did it. It's an outside stimuli that may affect you in a negative way, but no one can make you mad. Only you can lose your own temper.
Yeah, I'll push back just a little bit because neurologically, the external environment will stimulate your limbic system to do something, but it only lasts for a few seconds, usually between 3 and 9 seconds. Any longer than that, and it is your choice, it's your thoughts. Remember the front tires of the car. You're thinking and you're doing. What you're thinking is about the thing that just made you upset, and you're doing is to stay there. That's up to you. When I teach the emotional functioning stuff, I teach it in waves, and the waves get increasingly large as life goes on. So when you're little, losing a toy might be a big event, but then as life goes on, it's not that big of an event. Losing a loved one may be a bigger event. The amplitude of the wave increases, but the duration of the time that your brain feels the pain or the fear or whatever it is the same duration every single time. So grandma can only die once. However long you choose to be sad about it is up to you. And usually anger, to Eddie's point, I would argue the same exact thing, which is that nobody can make you angry because anger is often, if not always, I would say it's always secondary to something more fundamental, more rudimentary, more vulnerable, like shame or guilt or sadness or fear. And if we're not good at tolerating those emotions, we will choose anger or contempt because it acts as a proxy emotion. It gives the brain something to feel that's not really the actual feeling. And that's why we have emotional residue. We didn't actually tend to the real feeling. We just chose anger to mask it over and give us a sense of control. And guess what? It does because you're the one choosing the anger. You are in control of that. But in doing so, you're handing your power over to the person or the thing or the event or whatever it is that quote unquote made you angry. So
This is
it's
kind of
very
a
inverted thinking. Go ahead.
and this is kind of a teaser for a future episode that we're going to do on cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive triangle. That's the thoughts in the brain. That's kind of a teaser for it. But Brandon, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, it was funny you mentioned that. I was actually thinking DBT, which I think DB was going to talk on that, but I remembered a technique called urge surfing. So essentially, you have emotions are like a wave. So, you have a trigger, and then you have a rise, and you have a peak, and then you have a come down. And that, come down is when you really have control over, those emotions. But I wanted to go back off to power and control, like how Jake was talking about, how sometimes it's important to yield and, de escalate. And I think that's something that firearms has really helped me with because, before I was a gun owner, before I, carried with me every day, if someone were to, not that this happened, often at all, but, if someone were to come up and insult me, or if, I'm driving down the road and somebody, like flipped me off or something like that, like I would react to that. That would be my initial response. But now, since I have a firearm, I have that power and control to be like, okay, like I don't want this to escalate.
Correct. And Come Down, by the way, is what happens when you're listening to the Bush album from 1995. Um, that's exactly how I teach the emotional functioning series is through the wave. And I did borrow that from DBT. And I'm really excited for the upcoming episodes because I think people are going to be really fascinated by this. I love, by the way, that you were gun neutral and now you're wearing a one of our board members' logoed T-shirts. Coleon Noir, baby.
And the wave thing is actually the wave theory is how like I hold a licensure and I work with a lot of people who struggle with addictions, and that is a core fundamental belief that we hold with addictions is the wave of the rise, the like when someone is addicted, the rise of that trigger, the want, and how we ride that wave through the triggers of want.
It's so funny when you hear people that are anti-gun, or maybe they're just afraid of guns or gun ignorant, and they say like, because I've seen like the USCCA. I remember um, John Oliver did a segment on USCCA and almost saying that people who have firearms insurance are going to be more likely to shoot people, right? Like that's what they alluded to. Um, just complete nonsense. But why do you think people say well, that person shouldn't have a gun. Like a teacher shouldn't have a gun because what if he gets in a fight with a student, an argument with a student, and then he just pulls out his gun? They almost act like the gun makes you lose control of the power and the, you know what I mean? Like it's a weird thing that they kind of bestow on other people.
I think it's because they point to the outliers in society. We all can go Google right now and try to find videos of someone who pulled a gun out in a situation where they shouldn't have, or acting like a complete idiot, or the road rage situations. And unfortunately, people those situations like take over the complete narrative, and so then they paint us all as this like crazy bloodthirsty person ready to like murder everyone around them when they lose their temper.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is just like, they don't know the culture, and I know that's like a big part of, like what we're trying to teach, but they don't know like all of the safety that goes into it, and they don't know all like the precautions and all the training that goes into it. So I think that's a big part of it as well.
Guns are mysterious to a lot of people who aren't familiar with them, and that's if half the country owns or lives with firearms, then that means half the country doesn't, and that's a lot of people to be uh, ignorant of what the culture is like. I love Rob Pincus's analogy to car culture. We could make the same analogy to say, well, if you got a car, you're more likely to just go run people over if you're in a bad mood. But the culture behind being trained to drive a car is that it's a huge responsibility. I frequently find myself driving down the road wondering why people don't just steer over the yellow line and plow into people more often. And I think that the social contract among drivers is that you just don't do that because ultimately you're injuring yourself at that point too. Now, I understand that there's, the single vehicle rollovers and the head-on collisions are sometimes they are suicides that are turned outwardly into mass death, where you end up taking somebody else's life because you're driving 70 miles an hour on a two-lane highway and decide that it's time to end it and you're going to take somebody else with you, and that's rude and that's awful, and it happens. But why doesn't it happen more often? You got 300 million guns in this country, or whatever we got, 130 million gun owners. And why does it not happen more often? Because the culture prevents it from happening. It's the outliers, and the outliers make news. And so the half of America that doesn't understand it is going to gravitate to the outliers because guess what? Their limbic brain responds to that as though it's a threat and as though that threat is lurking around every corner. School shootings are infinitesimally insignificant statistically with regard to their occurrence. But what does everybody do? They think about school shootings and how much trauma we're putting our kids through by teaching them how to defend themselves if somebody breaks into the school and starts shooting it up. Well, we do the same thing with fire drills. Nobody stops to think that that's traumatizing kids. It's not. It's based on the culture of what you introduce to your children. If the culture is, hey, on a rare random occurrence, very, very rare, so rare that lightning strikes people more often than school shootings happen, we say, but in the event that this happens, you want to be prepared. Same thing with going in the outdoors and plotting your campsite. You don't pitch your tent in a gully or a culvert or a wash bed because a flash flood might happen. Flash floods don't really happen that often. But what do? We prepare for them and we say, don't put your tent in the gully. So we have to balance this with logic, and I'm pointing my frontal lobe right now, and you can't see that on the audio, but the frontal lobe is where the logic comes from, and logic is where statistics live. And if we're driven by statistics and analysis, balanced with reason, say we're just being prepared, then I think yeah, our tornado drilled Eddie just dropped in the chat. um, we do that, and in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we did well. We didn't. I wasn't around then, but my parents and your
The
parents
nuclear
probably
blast
did
drill.
yeah, exactly. Nuclear blast drills. Because
Hide under your desk so you don't see
the
the
little
mushroom cloud
four-leg,
coming.
yeah, the four-legged desk you're under is going to protect you from the from the fallout. So yeah, and I think that explains it. And if we go back to the basic needs, what is the anti-gun or the gun ignorant population trying to do? They're trying to gain control. They're trying to execute their survival need based off of misperception statistically of what that looks like. And I get it, and that's fine. We can have a reasonable conversation about how they can meet their control need better by not issuing legislation that is restricting to other people's freedom, fun, survival, love and belonging, power and control.
So, Jake, you mentioned that, and I'm wondering, so kind of going back to a choice, everyone has a choice as to, like how they, go through these needs and how they, try to fulfill those basic needs. So I feel like, in a way they have a choice as to whether, they want to educate themselves. So what do you feel like the main thing is that's holding them back from educating themselves further on stuff like this?
I think a couple things. One, they don't know that they can because they don't know that there's a non-threatening way to do it. And two is the ego. Once a person makes his or her mind up about something, it's very hard to change the mind because if you're not good at holding your beliefs loosely or your ideas or your thoughts loosely, what ends up happening is they become conflated with who you are as a human being. So if you make your mind up about a certain topic, we tend to define ourselves as our beliefs. Changing the beliefs then results in changing who I am. At least that's what my brain tells me. And
Mhm.
my job is to push back and say, that's not true. What you think is not who you are. So it's twofold. Even if somebody wanted to change their mind about it, it's really hard to find education opportunities, which is why Walk the Talk America exists. Just watch our first introductory video and you can learn a lot about gun culture that will change your mind. And everybody who's gone through our class, everybody who's taken that uh, the self-paced program comes away saying, I had no idea about all these things. Connie Ray, who is a local area on-air personality here, she's the she's the subject of, and she produced our 30-minute documentary that's available on the website and on her YouTube channel, and on her YouTube channel, actually, I should say. Um, she Ray is spelled W-R-A-Y. If you want to look that up, Connie Ray, and the her production is called The Next Stage, and she interviews a bunch of people, and we're one of them. And it's called Gun Violence something. And she realized that um, she had an irrational fear of firearms. When she met Mike and I during a podcast for our Nevada Crisis Support Services, she realized that her fear of guns was probably irrational, and she had to confront it. Now that's a very humble, very bold way of looking at life to say, I know what I don't know, and I want to change my mind. And she walked through this documentary where we took her out in the desert and we taught her how to shoot a gun, and she shot for the first time, and she had a massive breakthrough. It's a very powerful, very emotional documentary. And the whole reason behind her fear of guns was because her daughter, a Marine veteran, took her own life with a firearm. And Connie couldn't wrap her head around it, so she blamed the gun. I think more people doing that kind of thing, offering to change their minds about stuff, will lead to better harmony in society. However, I also understand how powerful the ego is, and I'm staring at a book right now called Dissolving the Ego, Realizing the Self. It's an edited compilation on the writings of David Hawkins, who's a very, very brilliant author. If you dissolve the ego, you do realize your true self. Your true self emerges. The problem is it's terrifying to look deep into oneself and realize the infinite potential that you have, because it opens up a vast array of options. And I, go back to what I was mentioning earlier about the options. More options does get you closer to what you want, which gets you closer to happiness. However, for a lot of people, more options just terrifies them and paralyzes them because it gives them anxiety trying to figure out which is the best option to choose. So I get why people don't want to change their minds. I'm not saying it's a good way to live, but that's probably the crux of it. That and the lack of educational resources. And the gun community hasn't been the friendliest in the past. That it's intimidating to walk into a gun store if you don't know what you're doing, because it's unfamiliar, and maybe we don't have the best instructors or the friendliest customer service. It's like
And
it's
I'll
hard.
just throw this out there because like you're talking about a lot of people like that they live on like they make this identity. So like politics is the big example. I am a Republican, I am a Democrat, I'm a libertarian, or what have you. And then you go, you're maybe your local gun shop has, maybe you're like a gun neutral or maybe even gun like anti-gun Democrat, but is open to and seeing things. And your local gun shop has Trump 2024, all these much flags. You're not going in that shop. You're just not going to do it. So like,
We
I'm
get
not trying to tell people who like if you're a gun owner or a gun shop what your personal beliefs are, but like maybe not like be so outright on it. And again, that's a very controversial topic, unfortunately, because of today's environment. But like if you're trying to bring people in, maybe not have like a big roadblock on the out as soon as you come in.
Yeah, that was one of the biggest things for, So when Colin Noir started making videos, right? I would my friends who were curious about firearms, or they were just like getting into it, or they wanted to accept new information. I would send them to Colin's videos to see some things, and there were times when like I remember one of my buddies like went into the comment section. He was just reading the banter between gun people in the comment section, and he's like, "Yeah, I can't mess with you guys." Right? Like it turned him off. And I'm like, well, that don't get too in the weeds with the comment section. Watch the video and listen to what the guy is saying. But it's to see the infighting amongst the gun community on certain topics is really ridiculous. And you're right, Eddie. Like sometimes it becomes, I think, a barrier to entry for people to get into it, because it's just like, man, they're fighting amongst themselves. They can't even agree on certain things. For every person who loves Trump that's a gun person, there's a lot of you know people that can't stand him because they feel that he turned his back on the gun industry, right? It depends on what degree you believe. Banning bump stocks, for example, um, pissed a lot of people off in the gun community. So they're like, forget Trump, but it's that you're never, once you bring politics into it and you bring all these other things into gun ownership, now you're going to have these fractions, that just fight amongst each other.
I think the
And
gun
the gun
community too
communities,
I was just gonna say, has a responsibility to acknowledge its diversity. I don't know how many times I walk around with my guns mental health sticker on my water bottle or my computer, and um, people will strike up a conversation with me about some conservative talking point. I'm like, I'm not that guy. I'm like, I thought you were a gun guy. It's like, yeah, the two don't necessarily walk together, which also is why I have my every civil right for every single person sticker from the Liberal Gun Club and the Liberal Gun Club sticker that says unicorns do exist, all on my computer. So I'm a walking conundrum to most people who can't put two ideas that seemingly are opposed into their heads, and that's our job. We want to bridge that gap and say the dialectic, which is the both and, can and does exist. You can be Chris Chang, you can be Laura Smith, you can be Randy Meon with political views that are to the left of center and be a strident advocate for the Second Amendment. The gun community has got to figure that out, that the LGBTQ community can and does own firearms, and they do it well. But because the gun community overwhelmingly is very conservative, and LGBTQ people are not always conservative, you don't see a lot of them around. So we got to learn how to embrace our diversity. Eddie.
and it's hard because like I remember the very first time I got introduced to Randy, like my first conversation was like, you're Democrat and like guns, and that just blew my mind. That trying to wrap the head around it. Now, what, like 5 years later, I'm on his podcast. He's a good friend of mine, and I'm over his house regularly shooting.
Yeah, I think it doesn't do the left any favors that every time gun control legislation comes up, it's all the blue camp that's doing it. That's they got to
it,
get
it
more active in
yeah, and
that
they,
too.
they they own they own that about themselves too. That is something that infuriates the whole liberal gun owners, liberal gun club, whichever have you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I feel like the guns and mental health stickers, like you mentioned, those are really great conversation starters. It's sometimes it kind of starts as like a funny, awkward thing because people like I've got the stickers and some wristbands on the table next to my couch in my office, and people they'll might be like a quiet spot in the session. They'll kind of look down and be like, guns and mental health, those don't mix. I'm like, oh, well, actually, and then, I kind of give them the little spiel, but it's funny to see like, how people will come back and they'll have the guns and mental health sticker on their phone or on their Yeti, or they'll be wearing a bracelet. And it's really cool to kind of see how that branches out.
We're doing good work for sure. So there's one last thing we maybe want to address here because it's right in our lane, is that the ATF came out with a letter recently. So we're recording this late July, and they just posted this letter in response to a Biden executive order that was issued in March. Basically, it says, Biden's talking about reducing gun violence, making our communities safer, and what this letter does is it gives clarification and instruction that FFL, which is Federal Firearms License, stores, dealers can store firearms in a time of crisis. And the letter basically gives two options: providing a storage locker for individual use, or taking a firearm into inventory for storage. And they give, instruction on how to do that and what forms to use and so forth. And I think it's cool that they did this. But I was talking to my friend Jordan Slotnick, who runs Reno Guns and Range here. He says that didn't change anything for us. All it did was, clarify. We've been doing that the whole time. So I think that's cool. I think it's neat now that we have federal direction on gun stores being able to take in firearms in a time of crisis or not. If you're just leaving town and you don't want your home broken into, you can drop your guns off at a gun store. And it's the government saying, hey, this is okay. Because I think a lot of gun stores were skittish about taking in people's guns because they thought there was some inherent liability, and there just isn't. If you quote unquote give the guns back too soon, well, it's not up to you. The person, there's no form, there's no interview, there's no psychological evaluation. You just go through the same process you would to get any gun back, and that's you got to go through your background check and you fill out the 4473. And maybe people don't want to do that. Maybe it costs too much money. That's fine. But at least now we're starting to see the emergence of clarification from the feds that says, yes, this is allowable. We don't have to wonder anymore. Thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
there's positive legislation like in Louisiana that actually states that if you give someone's gun back and maybe they go do something horrific with it, that you will not be held liable. And I think that's the type of legislation we need to move towards in other states. I think it just makes sense because the biggest barrier to entry is people saying, I don't want to be responsible for that. Even though you could turn around and say, like, if you didn't take someone's guns in, the family probably could still sue you in the United States, right? With the way things work. Like if I was a gun shop owner and they're like, he came to you and he wanted to hand over his firearms and then you didn't take them because you were worried about liability. And then he went out and he shot himself later. I mean, I think you could be just as liable there, but I mean, who knows if that happens, or who even knows if there's been instances where people have been sued. Like you said, Jake, I've never even heard of an instance where someone said I gave the guns back too soon, or we've never seen any kind of article or proof of it. But yeah, I'm glad that people are starting to recognize that it's important. I was working in DC a few years ago, and Russell Lemley from the VA was talking about wanting to get storage lockers. Now, the barrier to entry there would be there are going to be people that are like, if the government paid for storage lockers at gun shops, I would not put my gun in there, right? But and I get that part, but there's a lot of people that probably would take advantage of that. And I think that's the most important thing. I love that idea because it's like, okay, gun shops are burdened with a couple things, right? That responsibility of handing the firearm back too soon. Also, to the space and the cost, right? So I thought if the government could step in and provide storage devices and locker units, and then there could be something worked out where people could take advantage of that, just like your radios. Radio, it has different genres of music on it. You don't throw the whole thing out just because you don't like country or hip hop, right? You don't have to take advantage of what is being offered if you don't want to, if you don't want to trust a government locker. I get it. But some people would in a time of crisis. So that's my take on it.
It's a good take. I never actually considered that, with all the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars thrown around to these programs, that they could actually buy physical infrastructure and offer it. And we don't need it, you know, 15 lockers in a small store. You need like three, at most. They probably never get used, but at least they're there. And that provides some plausible deniability too if the lawsuit ever comes down and say, hey, we gave them a shot. We participated in this program. We got the flyers on our counter. We have conversations at the purchasing, point of purchase. I think that's a great idea. And I get the mistrust of the government locker, right? But to your point, there are people who would do that. Trust the government with a lot of things. Um, DMV registration, for example. Nobody seems to blink at that.
That aliens weren't real for years. Got it in, guys.
Nobody thought aliens weren't real. Let's be honest. Well,
The timely
yeah,
part about this is there. It was just in the news. If you're listening to this years later,
yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, it just came out. The government actually acknowledged that their aliens are real. So I think that makes for a good podcast. I think we've hit a good stopping point. I want to do some takeaways and wrap up. We'll start with let's start with Mike. Actually, what's your big takeaway from this conversation about the basic needs and the storage and all that stuff we covered?
No, I mean, just the big takeaway is, like I said, when you were going over it, was just seeing how much this applied to the 2A community, which is really cool. Like, I going into this conversation, because I am not one of the mental health people on this podcast, right? I'm the ASU grad ungun gun guy, and when you were going over it, I was like, man, this makes perfect sense of why gun owners should know this. So that was my biggest takeaway.
Brandon.
That aliens are real.
you stole mine.
No, I'd say, my big takeaway is that you always have a choice. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, it could be a double-edged sword, and whatever choice you make may not, get you the best results. Just being able to use your critical reasoning skills and find out what the best choice is for you is what's important, and just knowing that you always do have a choice.
Well, he said, I'm still going to say, little 8-year-old coast to coast fan Eddie is validated right now. But I really appreciated today's episode. Jake, you did a fantastic job on this, explaining this, and the way you explained this out is, I think it's going to be very well received. And I know this is how you explain it out to your clients. I just want people to understand that, like, you don't have to be your own expert. You don't have, this information's out there, seek it. And if you're not ready to go to therapy, this information's out there. You don't have to see a therapist to get well. And part of this information we're doing right this is for that. We're trying to get information out there.
Andy stole my takeaway, which is not really my takeaway, but it's my exhortation every time I talk, is that I'm trying to work myself out of a job. Truly, I'd be happy to do any other work if it meant that I was in a healthy community. So that's why we do this. We do this to produce information that is passively inviting and non-threatening, and you can consume it in your own time on your own device. And you don't have to ever step foot in my office. If you take this stuff and it works, then great, you solved your own problem. Awesome. I don't ever want to see you. That's great. Like, work me out of a job. So I invite people to really wrap their minds around that and realize that while we're here for you for deep troubles, if it's a surface trouble and this stuff works, please use it. It's awesome. So, well, thanks, fellas. And on behalf of our Walk the Talk America family and all our platinum sponsors, and certainly for Zephyr Wellness for continuing to allow me to do this, I really appreciate you all, and share it around. Don't keep this to yourself. We're certainly not keeping it to ourselves. It doesn't do any good locked up in our heads. So share it with a friend. And until next time, we wish you all great mental wellness. Bye bye.